Because I know Jim knows it, and then it's going to come up.
Gary came in and he's going to
at the top.
very nice. Good.
Have you met
He was a friend before that. He's a good guy. I'm actually going to help him out with the registration drive on campus to get students out there.
Hey everyone, can I get your attention? So, I have your attention. All right, thanks Dan. All right everyone, my name is Dan Torres, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing my good friend Tim Rogers and Zephyr Teachout tonight. I want to start about my friend Tim. Tim grew up in New Paltz. He knows where we've been, where we're going, and he knows where we're at as well. Tim serves on our school board, and he's also served on the planning board as well. And for those of you who don't know, those are absolutely the two hardest volunteer positions you could possibly do. They require a lot of work. I hear the pay isn't very good. And of course, there's a lot of issues with that. So Tim has brought a great amount of energy to both of those positions. On the school board, Tim's been the chair of the Legislative Action Committee, where he's talked about issues that affect our students and how Albany's played a role with that and works to try to make those better. On our planning board, Tim's brought a same level of energy as well. For those of you who don't know, the Wilmerite project, for example, Tim was right in the middle of that and talked. And I think if it wasn't for Tim and a number of other people in our community, it's possible that that tax giveaway would have already happened. So that's something we should really appreciate. Now, the village of New Paltz is only about 6,000 people. It's about 1.5 miles long, but in many ways it's kind of a microcosm of what we want our world to be, right? It's got senior citizens, seniors in high school, seniors in college. It's retirees and growing families, and it's very progressive as well. And if there's someone I want to see lead that torch and continue for our community to be a main street of local businesses opposed to Five Guy burger stands, it's Tim Rogers. Some of you got that joke. So with that, I'd also like to introduce Zephyr Teachout. For those of you who don't know, her name is Zephyr Teachout, which sounds like a progressive superhero. She is an accomplished author, a professor at Fordham, and of course she ran for governor as well. And hey, she was not successful in her race for governor, but that does not mean that she didn't do something incredibly successful. She started an important narrative in our state, and she really kicked that off. She's more or less New York's Elizabeth Warren, if you will. Progressive movements don't have to be successful at the ballot box to be successful initially. You know, in New Paltz, you got about 90% of the vote. I was disappointed it was so low. But if we look at the history of the modern progressive movement, I think we can date it back to 1912. Teddy Roosevelt ran as a Bull Moose Party member. And he had a coalition of candidates who ran all over the country, and they all universally, for the most part, lost. Almost everywhere. But about 20 years later, at the Democratic National Convention, the Democrats got ready to nominate a candidate. He was a governor from New York, and he was backed by Tammany Hall, and his name was Andrew Cuomo. No. His name was Al Smith. But they changed how you vote on candidates, and instead they adopted the Bull Moose platform from 1912 and ended up endorsing a different Roosevelt to run. And many of those ideals that you saw in 1912 became a reality 20 years later. I don't think it's going to be 20 years before a number of things that Zephyr Teachout advocated for become a reality in New York State. But with that, I'd like to turn it over to Zephyr Teachout.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. You have to understand that when I met Tim, he came to a campaign event at which there were 4 people, 3 of whom from his family, which is the first time I met you. in Poughkeepsie on a rainy day. So this is a much better showing. I'm going to be really brief because I want you guys to get a chance to hear Tim speak, which is the point. But I will say that my campaign manager was very excited when Tim ran seriously, and then also because Tim did the best petition gathering of anybody in the state in one particular way. He had the most legible handwriting of anyone, but the legibility was part of a general professionalism. He was a volunteer on the campaign, but he was a real professional on the campaign, really easy to work with, engaged other people, and that's what I think he can do as a mayor as well, is be really open, manage well, accessible, and then care about the values that you guys care about so much here. We have talked both about energy policy and moving towards 100% renewable energy in New York, starting with local community efforts, and then also about education policy and the importance of genuinely supporting public education, and a vision of New Paltz Village where you have a kind of amazing manager who's open and accessible, pushing forward these platforms, makes them seem possible to other parts of the state and other parts of the country. So with that, I'm delighted to be here, and I really look forward to hearing your speech. So I'm officially, just in case you didn't know, I am officially endorsing Mr. Rogers.
Thanks, guys. This is an exciting turnout to see so many good friends and supporters, and I'm definitely honored that Zephyr has agreed to support my candidacy. I really, couldn't think of any kind of political figure that I would be more excited to have an endorsement from. Her run for governor last year energized many of us with positions that folks in New Paltz care about deeply, like renewable energy, the abuse of money in politics, and supporting public education from privatization threats for both K through 12 and our state university system. Zephyr's platform resonated with me as a volunteer on our town planning board and our school board. That was very important to me because I find it completely unacceptable that real estate developers seek to impact policy via access or campaign contributions, or when for-profit testing companies or curriculum companies and textbook companies try to dictate public education policy. But what I think is really unique about New Paltz is we don't really have partisan disagreements. We're generally very passionate and feel similarly about issues like those. Our community is definitely grateful that our civic activists, including Mayor Jason West, worked hard to support gay marriage 10 years ago, and other members of our community, including Supervisor Susan Zimmett, challenged Walmart many years before that. But I'm running for mayor because I support our tradition of being an activist community. But I feel strongly that there's significant room for improvement regarding management within our local government. We need to do a better job following through on more renewable energy and green initiatives. We need to work in conjunction with our village employees who do a fantastic job, but would appreciate higher quality support from the village board. For example, if changes are made to village codes, we have to be more aware of unintended consequences and what they mean for our enforcement officers and their daily responsibilities. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work that I've done challenging the certificates of occupancy at 2 Mohonk Avenue. And I think that's a great example of some missteps that were taken and hopefully will be corrected, and we need better process and practice to not have things like a housing complex like that constructed in our community where community character and our tax base, and the safety of our residents and volunteer firemen matter incredibly. So in summary, it's very important for our community to regularly step back and remind ourselves of our shared beliefs. I think what's great about New Paltz is we generally agree that we want to get from point A to point B. And we sometimes get sidetracked by disagreeing on the paths that we should take. And we'll argue unnecessarily about how to get from point A to point B. I feel like I'm someone who can follow through on a task and ensure that we maintain momentum, stay headed in the right direction, and not get mired in conflict by style or opinion differences. We have an incredible uniqueness here in New Paltz in that we're on the same page when it comes to a lot of big picture issues. So what I would really like to do is have us focus more on harnessing this strength. And that's what I would hope and intend to do as mayor of the village. So if you're feeling motivated to support my campaign, we'll have a sign-up sheet if anyone wants to volunteer to help with canvassing and getting the word out. And if anyone feels motivated to contribute monetarily, that's also appreciated. But and this is just to pay for things like mailers and signs. We're not looking to influence policy here or allow anyone else to influence policy.
Go Tim!
I'm sure you're open for questions. Is that true?
Sure.
But I think I'm certainly happy to answer questions, not about New Paltz Village, but if you want to answer questions, if people have questions, is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Questions for me or Zephyr? That sounds like a lot of fun. And who's
Tim?
first?
Sometimes in our community, passionate people disagree, and we read that personalities sometimes get in the way of that path. What would you bring to a group of passionate people that want to get to B, but right now they're arguing over the path? How do you see that happening? What experience do you have that might help in that getting us to B?
Well, I think it's perfectly okay to disagree with each other. And what we need to do when we disagree is to maybe step back and say, okay, we're disagreeing on these details. However, as I said in my comments, when we step back and look at bigger picture items, what are we trying to achieve? And I think that's something that's unique about New Paltz is we're generally trying to go in the same direction and achieve the same things. And you don't have to become so upset or frustrated that your colleague or your neighbor thinks that we should maybe take a left and another turn before we figure out a solution to this problem. It's like there are going to be different approaches, glasses half full, glasses half empty, and that's all perfectly okay. And I think we need to have a little bit more tolerance for each other's differences of opinion.
Any other questions?
Dovetailing on Paul's question, if you become the mayor, our former mayor, Jason West, and our current supervisor, Sue Zimmett, apparently, as reported in the paper until last month, hadn't really been able to communicate. How would you envision yourself communicating with the supervisor, and on what issues do you think you could see the village and the town working together? For instance, on a sewer project, upgrades like that, other types of things.
Well, I think that's just it. Like, we don't necessarily need to sit at the table and come up with a solution immediately. I believe in incremental steps to come up with solutions. And I think committing to an ongoing dialogue is probably one of the most important things when you're meeting with someone who you might not agree with on other issues, but just, again, looking towards, the end result, trying to achieve things incrementally, trying to look at things that we can agree on and build upon, those small achievements.
Could you give one example of a renewable energy project you're interested in? Or two, or whatever example you were?
Yeah, one thing that I think is really interesting, and I know that there's been a few tries in the past, would be to have the municipalities, the town, the village, the other taxing authority, the school district, kind of get on the same page and look at, and this has been tried, but there were some headaches in terms of securing enough funds to update distribution lines, but to create some sort of like solar farm or a collection of solar arrays out at the town-owned dump. I would rather see us put energy and effort into sourcing electricity from a solar farm versus allowing Central Hudson to dig up our streets and put piping in so they can distribute natural gas, which 30% of it is currently fracked, and in the future we can anticipate a whole lot more of the natural gas being fracked horizontally. So that's definitely one thing that and that's again like a bigger, longer term project. Sure, we could look at individual smaller projects, but I think we need to do both. We need to look at lower hanging fruit that we can try to become successful with in the short term, but then also like have our eye on longer term, larger prizes as well.
If you're curious about shameless promotion of a free show later, if you're curious about your own individual solar, geothermal, and wind opportunities, we're doing a show at I forget where. Yes, SUNY New Paltz, but I forget what hall. Lecture Center 100. Lecture Center 100 with Josh Fox showing what individuals can do later tonight from 6 to 8. Anybody can come. They'll be singing.
And I guess like another thing that's really important to me, if we're looking at any sort of renewable energy option, like I really believe that we need to look at these things through the lens of return on investment too, because I think we'll set ourselves up for failure if we just go down a green path and it doesn't make sense longer term, and you're going to empower the naysayers if you pursue something that's not sustainable with a small s. It has to be sustainable. It has to have a defensible return on investment as well. That's very important to me.
Yes.
Any other questions?
I have a question. You mentioned about the code and changes in the code leading to unintended consequences sometimes, but sometimes the code is very clear. It's just simply not enforced. And
I couldn't agree with you more.
and this has led to dramatic changes in several different neighborhoods, on Mill Rock, on Prospect, on Church, to Mohawk Avenue. And I just wondered what your approach to seeing that the code is actually enforced. What would you do to change the problems with enforcement?
That's really my passion and probably the main reason that I'm running for mayor. But I talk about this regularly with people, and they're like, "Wow, that sounds really boring." Don't talk to people about that if you're trying to get elected. So I think the simple answer to that is absolutely. I've read our code, and we have a lot of great code that we can hang our hat on, and certain things should not have been constructed the way they were constructed. And
I can vouch for him being very good at very boring things.
I was scared to ask the question because I knew it was boring, but...
No, but it's serious. That's part of my point about why he was such a successful volunteer with the collecting petitions is hard work and it's boring work sometimes and getting everything right. But I can vouch for his investment in the boring.
But I don't think it's boring.
Right,
That's the difference.
It's not boring.
I
Yeah,
love
and that's
it.
very, I think
it's
that's
not
very
boring.
important. And I think it's very
It's
important.
boring to other people.
Yeah.
Except to the neighborhoods that have been dramatically affected.
Right, and that's
there's
why it's
many all
so-
over town, or all over the village.
And that's why it's so important. That's why it is so important. And it blew me away because when I returned to New Paltz, like I grew up here and then was away for a while, and then I returned 2.5 years ago, and you see development, and you're like, well, how did that single-family home get built with a giant addition, a few feet away, and it's connected by a breezeway? And you're told, oh, well, our code is really complicated, and it allows for stuff like that to happen. I've read the code. There's nothing in the code that allows for that to happen. And if anything, there are things in the code that would prevent that from happening.
So what would you do to make sure the code was enforced?
Two things. Supervise and manage the building department better. And also, when you think about code generally, you have to empower the building department. Like there's some discussion about some changes to the code, which I think we'd be headed in the wrong direction, where you need code that the building department and the building inspectors, you have to set them up for success. If the code is too complicated to enforce, then they're going to fail, and we're going to face the consequences as a community. So it's really two things. It's supporting and managing, and then thinking broadly about the consequences and unintended consequences of code.
One more.
I just want to say that Tim's been very active in this woman here, in our battle on Elting Avenue with these kind of problems he's talking about. And he seems to really know what the code is and what the laws are and so on. But my question is about parking, in that it doesn't seem to me that there's ever going to be a blanket solution for the whole village. That every street is so Prospect is very different than Elting. It's very different than every street is different, and you're never going to find a solution that just takes care of everything. Every street has to be thought of, and some streets are narrow, some streets are wide. So I just wanted to get you to talk about parking just a little bit. Another boring section.
Yeah, and I've written about our parking challenges in at least one long, boring letter to the editor. But I completely agree, Mike. Each street has its own uniqueness in terms of its own dynamics and why there are cars on that street and why different people use that street for parking. And then we have other needs as far as like downtown businesses. It would be fantastic if we had some sort of municipal parking solution. And then we also have this mix of landlords who are required to have X number of spots based on X number of bedrooms. I just think, these things have to be looked at both individually and they have to be looked at in aggregate. And it's not easy work.
And again, unintended consequences. Sometimes you pass something and then you don't realize this guy's got a one-car driveway, this
Right.
people have to take the bus, whatever the case, where it snows, it's narrow, it's wide.
Right. And I think it's a fine line between being proactive and looking for solutions, but also like not just shuffling and reshuffling the deck. And that gets back to those unintended consequences thing. And I think same thing with the renewable energy idea. You kind of have to have like a big picture idea in terms of longer term goals, how to deal with parking, and then you have to look at things on a micro level and like, well, this half of Prospect Street versus that half of Prospect Street, and we can't just like throw Band-Aids and then expect all of our parking situations to be solved. So it's we have to listen. We have to listen to the local residents. We have to listen to the landlords. We have to listen to the downtown merchants. And I think that's government's job, is to do a better job of listening before we legislate.
And when is this vote?
Cinco de Mayo. May 5th, Tuesday, Village Hall. I think you had your hand up first.
What are your thoughts about the location for the bus station?
The location for the bus station, I think, I'm a big proponent of having things in the core of our community, whether it's the middle school, the bus station. I like the idea that we are a walkable community, that students can walk to the bus station and go home, that village residents can walk to the bus station and go to work. But I know that there are challenges with big diesel buses coming in and out of the core of your community. So, I mean, if you're gonna put force me to answer that question, I'm generally in favor of the bus station in the core of the community.
And that's one of the reasons why I bought a house, because there is a bus station here. But I wondered what your thoughts were, Tim, on sidewalks in the village for pedestrians to enjoy themselves. If you had any thoughts on that. Wider sidewalks.
Yeah, wider sidewalks and better code enforcement. So when it snows, currently it's the responsibility of the property owners to maintain their own sidewalks. I also, I would maybe like to explore the village being more involved in snow removal. That's an additional expense, but I think there's some benefit that, and I think the greater community, both folks in the village and the town, benefit from being able to walk down a sidewalk that's clear and safe versus walking in the road when there's ice on the roads, which, I mean, sure, all of us do that regularly. When you can't walk through that, 1 foot of slush, you have to walk on Main Street in the dark with oncoming traffic. And that's I'm a big proponent of maintaining and updating and having great sidewalks.
Yeah, thanks.
I just wanted to ask another question about the code. I've looked into some of these building developments that have really impacted our quality of life and the safety of all the residents, including the people who live there and the people surrounding the business or the commercial developments. And the state code doesn't allow for most of what's gone on. So how do you think we'll better enforce state code? Or the code enforcers, not necessarily me or you, but yeah.
In terms of state code versus local code?
Right, because we don't have control over the state code, and the state code exists, and it has to be enforced for our safety, especially fire codes. So how do you
Fire
think
codes,
we'll
like,
get those
state
enforced?
code says when you construct a building that's greater than 2 stories from stick frame construction, it must have automatic sprinkler systems. We had buildings recently built that do not have automatic sprinkler systems. That's state code. That's not in our local code.
Right.
How did that happen?
Exactly. How did that happen? So how do we make sure that these codes are being enforced? If you were talking about how if we change our own codes, there are unintended consequences, but we don't have any control over state codes, and those aren't being enforced.
Yeah, it gets back to code enforcement. Again, it's an incremental process. I think we have to look at our existing code, make sure enforcing to the best we can what we currently have before we automatically just create new legislation.
No, I know. I understand that part, but we can't change state code if
We cannot,
those
no.
are not being followed. It's the state code that I'm worried about, because we don't affect that code in any way with our legislation being in the village.
The only way we can affect it is we can have local code that's more stringent than state code, provided that we get some sort of approval from some state entity that allows us to do that. So we can't have code that's less stringent than state code, but we can be more stringent.
Yeah, that's great, but we're not even meeting the minimum of the state code on a lot of the developments. So that's what's concerning me. I have a small child, and we have a terrible development very close to us, and we've been looking into it for years, and it's just, it's just not being dealt with. So, we're trying to deal with it even more now. So I just want to see our building inspectors and code enforcers enforce the code, and if we have no control over the minimum code being at the state level, then that should be able to be enforced, minimally.
Yeah, well, me too, and I've met and spent many, many hours talking with our code enforcement folks, and generally, I think their heads are where they should be, and they probably sometimes feel challenged because they're not getting enough or the right type of message or supervision or management from village government. That's really, as I said before, what has motivated me to run for mayor. Yeah, so I think there are individuals who work in the building department, and you know, I don't want to accuse the building inspectors of doing things incorrectly, because I think many times they feel like they are looking at things correctly and they can defend their actions, and so I don't think it's you know, it's necessarily errors on their part or mismanagement. I think it's complicated, it's difficult, you know, like anything that's important, there are nuances, and it'll make a difference to, you know, to have better management of that department in particular. Good.
I have to leave pretty soon, but there's one more question.
I don't know if I should open this can. How do you feel about the consolidation of village and town? I mean, I personally don't really understand the benefits or the reasons against it, but I know it's a hot topic, and a lot of people think that it would, I guess, save money and resources to consolidate. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think there are definitely, intellectually I understand why we would look more closely to consolidate, and I think there are benefits to going down that path. I think we can test some of those concepts, and some of that has already begun with just an emphasis on sharing services, and you know, the DPW for the town and the village are you know, have in the last couple of years are working together, and I think we can test more of those concepts with individual initiatives, and you know, head down that path, and then see if it makes sense to combine the municipalities, because sure, there are definitely efficiencies to be had, but you know, there's also, you know, what's interesting, and Dan Torres pointed this out to me a long time ago, that you know, we do have this unique situation where the town and the village share the same name, so we think that we're supposed to be the same thing, but you can also make the case that a more dense municipality has just very different needs than the ring around that municipality, like, you know, townships versus towns, which they have all over New Jersey, and you know, so there's a case to be made both ways.
Okay, thank you.
I want to thank you guys for showing me what democracy looks like, because it does come down to code, and you know, and I seem to be the only one who's patronizing the local beer. This is the advantage of no longer running for governor. What? That's not a Guinness. It's not a Guinness. That's the local beer. But I think it's really exciting, and I think that there's sort of, at my own sense of where you guys are now, is there's a real exciting opportunity to take the values and implement them in a very exciting way that, again, can be a model for other communities. So I loved listening to you, and nice to meet you.